You know, I think sometimes these problems are compounded because we forget that there's a lot of people working down there that have different priorities. You know, the media are there to show you oil. They want to find it and they want to show it to you. And so it's real common for people to get a shot from the air where they're really shooting some kind of organic material coming out of the marshes or the like. And then it comes to your lab and other labs along the Gulf Coast, and you have to deliver the news about what these things are and try to explain to people how the mistake was made. That's correct?
Absolutely. I know when the spill started, people would fly out, the news media would fly out in helicopters, and they would fly out for an hour and a half and not see any oil. And all of a sudden, there's a big patch of oil down there, and so they would start circling it. And the picture was that there's oil like this everywhere. The truth is it was not. It was very patchy. There was globs of oil offshore. Now, there were a lot of globs, but there was a mostly open ocean that didn't have these massive globs of oil in it. So, but getting that picture, nobody wants to see ocean water where there's nothing in it. So when you're talking about an oil spill, you fly out and you focus on what's out there, oil. But that doesn't mean the whole environment is completely coated with oil.
Right. Yeah, I had that experience when I took a few news crews out in helicopters, and people would say, you know, the camera was ready, and they'd say, well, here's oil over here. No, that's organic material.
Right.
Here's oil over here. No, that's minerals up on the beach. And at first, you almost lose your credibility because everybody thinks there's oil everywhere. But thank God there wasn't as much as we thought. But thank you for that, because that's a real public service, I think, when scientists come out and talk to people to help them understand more what these things are.
Well, trained observers know what oil looks like, and most of the people that go out looking for oil were not trained observers, and so they tend to see anything that's not looking like clear water as calling it oil. That's just not the case. You've got to rely on people that have done it before and understand what it looks like.
Well, I think it's also safe to say that we're learning a lot more about some variabilities in our coastal ecosystem. Even though we understand that system well, we're now getting more reports of things that people fear are oil that turn out to be algae. And people are saying, well, is that algae stimulated by the breakdown components of oil? In some cases, it's probably just that people are reporting things now that they used to just look at and say, I wonder what that is, and pass right by it.
Absolutely. I remember sailing in Lake Pontchartrain, and we'd get out and see this yellow stuff floating in the water and didn't pay any attention to it. It didn't bother the sailing. We didn't think it was oil. It wasn't oil. It was a natural bloom of some sort. But this year, when there's a big spill, everything they see is related to the spill, and unfortunately, that's not the case.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's, again, a great service. Jesse, let's return to the Barrier Islands for a moment, the video we just watched. And Mr. Clark gave us a lot of information that wasn't shown there. What were some of the interesting things he talked about?
He actually had a couple of interesting things to say. That this is actually an opportunity for me to plug the website, too. If you go to Science.of.thScience, you can see all of the interviews in their entirety. But some of the things that he talked about are that some of the equipment that we saw and assumed was part of the cleanup effort is actually dredging, and material that's ordinarily being dredged from Gulfport's ship channel is going to be used in beach nourishment near Fort Massachusetts on West Ship Island. That was interesting and completely unrelated to the oil spill. But he was telling me a bit about the number of species that were affected Gulf-wide. Roughly 3,000. There weren't that many that were affected in Gulf Islands. The ones in Gulf Islands were mostly shorebirds, and there have been far fewer impacted animals observed since the well was capped. And finally, he was talking about some research that is beginning on the Gulf Islands that will be looking into the effects of the oil spill on the habitat. And those studies are just beginning as part of the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Program, and they'll be looking at not just how the animals are affected, but also how long is the oil staying, because they haven't been able to get it all, and at some point you have to stop because it becomes more damaging to keep trying. And so they'll be looking at how long does the oil stay and what kind of effect it has on those animals.
Yeah. Well, I guess a lot of naturalists are concerned that by sifting through the sands in vast quantities, you may be removing a lot of the food sources from the bottom of the ecosystem, or the species diversity is changing, or you know, we keep hearing reports, which I know are true because I've seen it myself, where the oil is settling down in the sand, and we're wondering what happens 3 or 4 years from now when that gets turned out in a storm.
Well, and actually that is something that you may have something to say about, Ed, because it's something that was observed in the Exxon Valdez oil spill. But another thing you're worried about in that context is that there are lots of animals that live on the beach, and they're not real obvious. They're not pelicans. They're not piping plovers. They're in the sand, and they're worms and shells and things like that. But
yes, sometimes when oil weathers, you know, it starts off and it's much more toxic than it is after it reaches this final weathering stage, which is these tar balls. So there's a question of how dangerous are those, and are you doing more damage to the ecosystem of a beach by removing them than leaving them there, right? They're not easy to digest. They don't readily dissolve. They weather very slowly, break apart, and they will be on the beach for several years to come. I mean, it's just from after the Ixtoc spill on South Padre Island, tar balls were washing up at an elevated level for several years. And so that's going to happen along our coastal beaches. It's happening up in the marshes, but of course you can't see the tar balls in the marshes because they get hid by all the grass. So they're pretty obvious on a white sandy beach when you walk along and you step on something funny and you got a smudge of oil. But it's not really causing a lot of ecological damage. So the real question is it worth the effort to disrupt the beach structure, the animals that live there, because they are part of the food chain, part of the ecology of the Northern Gulf. And so the lesson for most spills is there's a time to stop and let Mother Nature handle it, and we are probably there now.
That's right.
Particularly on sandy beaches.
Sure. Well, you know, one of my favorite things to do when we go to the beach is to walk down the beach and try to find the critters that live in that sand that you're talking about. And it's not accidental that you see those little birds running up and down and pecking in the sand.
That's right.
They're not just pecking in the sand, they're feeding, and there's a wealth of species that live in that area. Well, let's talk about a topic that's on everybody's mind. Let's talk about seafood safety.
Exactly, and with the state and federal officials at the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources and the NOAA Fisheries Service and National Seafood Inspection Lab in Pascagoula, they're testing seafood harvested in the Gulf that's destined for seafood markets in Mississippi.
In the state of Mississippi, there are 3 regulatory agencies that have some say in that process. It's Department of Ag, the Department of Health, and the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Our role in seafood safety specifically is we have a Seafood Technology Bureau that's responsible for that. And in response to the BP oil spill, we've done several additional things than what we normally do. We've done this for decades. Keeping the seafood safe for the state of Mississippi. We do dockside evaluations. That means where our inspectors go down to the docks where the product is being landed and does evaluations of that product there. We also do the actual water quality. We do that in conjunction with the DEQ. We also do sampling of the product while it's out in the water. We take tissue samples of shrimp, crab, fish, and oysters.
The protocols and the standards that were used for sampling and for analysis of the seafood in response to the Deepwater Horizon were adopted at the federal level and at the state level. So there was consistency in how the sampling was done as well as how the analyses were done. All those samples come back to this lab. We have the National Seafood Inspection Laboratory that's part of this facility. So the sample processing is done here, the sensory analysis is done here, and then samples are sent to the Northwest Fisheries Science Center for chemical analysis.
So when we receive seafood samples at the lab in Pascagoula, Mississippi, they're processed and prepared for sensory testing, which is a well-developed test to detect odors from petroleum. If the sample passes that test, then the sample is analyzed by an analytical chemical test, which looks at specific compounds present in oil called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And the FDA, based on a lot of science, has determined that those are the compounds of concern from human health. So during this spill, those samples were sent to our Seattle National Marine Fisheries Service lab, where they were extracted and then put on a very sensitive instrument that separates the compounds into the individual compounds and then detects them at a very accurate and very specific way.
The types of species that we take, so far to date, we have 18 different representative species of fish that have been taken. And those are representative samples from the top waters, the pelagic type fish, and that would be things like mackerels and cobia and those type of, and they are offshore species of fish, and they're inshore species of fish. And then we got the mesic fish, and those things include things like the drums, the menhaden, and then we got our bottom dwellers, which are things like flounders and catfish and ground mullet, speckled trout. So it runs the whole gamut. We have three different species of shark that we've taken. So we're very confident that we're selecting the species that represent, as far as seafood safety, the things that the public would come in contact with, and those data are available on our website. And like I'll say again, they have all come back non-detect or well below the NOAA protocols for those hundreds or thousands of times, in some instances below those protocol levels.
Fish, shrimp, and clams, and bivalves as they're called, all handle pHs in a different way. These compounds have been in our environment for a long time, and so these animals have adapted to dealing with their presence. So in the case of shrimp and fish, they have the ability, when these compounds are taken up, to what's called metabolize them, turn them into compounds that can be more easily processed and then excreted, gotten rid of by shrimp and fish. And what that means is that the pHs that were taken up don't have the ability to get to the edible tissue, the muscle tissue. The public needs to recognize about difference between chemicals. They're not all the same, and in the case of pHs, they can be metabolized and excreted. Other compounds, they cannot.
There's new research, the dispersant research that was done for this oil spill. That was new research. That was something that we didn't have a lot of science behind. So there was, very, very quick turnaround time trying to get that research in place, get the results, look at the impacts of the dispersants on seafood safety. So that was, something we learned with this spill that will apply to the next spill.
During the spill, the American public and people in the Gulf became very concerned about the amount of dispersants that had been used and whether or not those dispersants posed a health risk to people consuming seafood. So in response to that, FDA and NOAA worked diligently during the spill to develop a new method to be able to detect a compound present in dispersants called DOS. Dioctyl sodium sulfosuccinate, big word, but it's just a compound in DOS that we felt would be a good marker of the presence of dispersant if it was present. But what we did know from the literature and the findings and what we know about these chemicals is that the potential for any accumulation of the dispersant compounds in seafood was very low.
The science, stands behind the results. And again, I would say that the seafood in the Gulf of Mexico is safe. There's nothing wrong with what's reaching the market right now. It's being checked at many different levels, and it's never failed.